The most dangerous man in Seoul was taking his fiancée to dinner, until he saw his ex crossing the street with twins. Welcome to the story of Kang Yi-min. Before we begin, drop a comment letting us know which city you're watching from. We love seeing how far these tales of redemption travel. If you enjoy emotional journeys filled with hidden truths, make sure to subscribe for more. Now, let's proceed to the story. Kang Yi-min adjusted his custom Patek Philippe, the cold platinum a perfect match for the calculating calm. He used to maintain his iron grip on the city's underworld. He guided his midnight black sports car through the winding, neon-lit streets of Gangnam, the engine a low growl of suppressed power. The late afternoon sun cast long, golden streaks across the leather interior, illuminating the woman beside him, Yoon Seorin. With her hair perfectly styled and designer sunglasses perched elegantly on her nose, she represented the perfect, uncomplicated strategic alliance he believed he needed. "The waiting list for this place is legendary," Seorin said, checking her reflection in the visor mirror with a light, carefree laugh. "I still can't believe you managed a table on a Friday." Yi-min smiled, his narrow, focused eyes fixed on the road ahead. At this stage in his life, he had learned that power and wealth could buy almost anything, including spontaneity. His dark hair, swept back to reveal the intricate, aggressive dragon tattoo climbing his neck, caught the light as he turned toward her. "Perks of overseeing half the city's trade," he replied. For Yi-min, simplicity felt like luxury. After years of demanding syndicate wars and emotional expectations he could never meet, this controlled, 3-month-old relationship was exactly what he wanted, long enough to enjoy her company, but short enough to avoid serious conversations about a shared future. The traffic light ahead turned red, and Yi-min brought the car to a smooth, silent stop. His phone buzzed with urgent work notifications, but he ignored them. Friday evenings were now sacred, reserved for high-end dates and conversations that never ventured into territory he wasn't willing to explore. "I love how relaxed you are these days," Seorin said, reaching over to touch his hand. "When we first met, you seemed so intense." Yi-min's grip tightened slightly on the steering wheel. Intense. That was the word his previous relationship had taught him about himself, that he was too focused on the empire, too unavailable for the kind of domestic life others craved. His breakup with Amani Rivers had been a clean cut, a necessary separation that allowed him to focus on his dragon persona without the traps of family dinners or engagement rings. The crosswalk ahead filled with evening pedestrians, office workers, couples, and teenagers navigating the intersection. Yi-min watched them absently, his mind already shifting to the vintage wine list when something caught his focus. A woman was crossing the street with a quiet steadiness that seemed to make the city noise flow around her. She wore a mustard-yellow dress that glowed softly in the daylight, her long, neat braids framing a calm, serious face. Yi-min's breath caught. On either side of her, anchoring her presence, were 2 young children mirroring her quiet strength, a boy in a dark polo and a girl in soft pink. They moved as a single unit, Nia and Noah, mirroring Yi-min's own alert stance. In that single, heart-stopping moment at the red light, the dragon realized his past was no longer invisible, and his simple luxury was about to become a cage of questions. The heavy silence of the car felt like a physical weight against Yi-min's chest as he steered the sports car away from the intersection. The image of Amani Rivers, radiant in mustard yellow, her hands anchoring 2 children who bore his unmistakable alert silhouette, was burned into his retinas like a flashbulb. Beside him, Seorin was humming a light tune, oblivious to the fact that the man she called relaxed had just seen his entire carefully constructed reality shatter in a single crosswalk. They arrived at the restaurant, an architectural masterpiece of glass and steel perched above the city, where the elite gathered to trade secrets over plates that cost more than a month of a regular citizen's rent. Usually, Yi-min thrived in this environment. He enjoyed the calculating calm, required to navigate high-stakes social posturing. But tonight, the atmosphere felt claustrophobic. As the maitre d' led them to their sacred corner table, Yi Min felt less like a king and more like a predator at rest, who had just realized he was being hunted by his own past. "You're being very quiet, Yi Min," Si-Horin noted, her designer sunglasses finally tucked away to reveal eyes that were beginning to narrow with suspicion. She reached across the white linen to touch his hand. "Is it the Tokyo merger? I thought we agreed no work talk tonight." "Just a long day," Yi Min managed, forcing a smile that didn't reach his steel-gray eyes. He picked up the wine list, but the vintage labels blurred into a single question. Why didn't she tell me? 1 year and 1 month had passed since their clean-cut breakup. He had been brutally honest then, telling Amani that his life had no room for the domestic traps of family dinners or holiday traditions. She had listened, nodded with that quiet steadiness, and walked away without a single accusation. Now he realized that her mature acceptance might have been a mask for a devastatingly lonely secret. The waiter arrived with a 1998 Chateau Margaux, pouring the deep crimson liquid with practiced grace. Yi Min took a sip, but the complex notes of the wine tasted like ash. Across the table, Si-Horin was describing a new gallery opening, her voice light and carefree, representing everything he thought he wanted: beauty without expectations, pleasure without responsibility. Yet his chest felt hollow. He found himself comparing the cold luxury of his current life to the warmth he had seen in the way Amani adjusted the small boy's polo shirt in the middle of a busy street. "When we first met," Si-Horin said, her voice pulling him back from the edge of a memory, "you said you needed someone who understood that your empire came first. That's why we work, isn't it? Because I don't ask for the things that make men like you feel trapped." Yi Min's grip tightened on the stem of his wine glass. She was right. That was the foundation of their uncomplicated alliance. But as he looked at her perfectly styled waves and polished exterior, he realized he was seeing a ghost of the man he used to be. He had spent years building a simplicity that was actually just an empty vastness. As dinner progressed, every light and carefree laugh from Si-Horin felt like an indictment. He realized that the simplicity he had craved was a lie he told himself to avoid a love so intense it would leave him breathless. Underneath the fine silk and the platinum watches, he was a father whose children were completely unaware of his existence. By the time the check arrived, Yi Min knew he couldn't go home to his silent penthouse. The uncomplicated life was over. The dragon had seen a glimpse of a different world, and for the first time in his life, he was willing to let his empire burn if it meant finding his way back to that crosswalk. Yi Min didn't return to the quiet, sterile luxury of his penthouse after dropping Si-Horin off. The air in his home felt too thin, a monument to a simplicity that now felt like a hollow tomb. Instead, he found himself in a nondescript office in Pioneer Square, the space smelling of dark roast coffee and old secrets. Marcus Webb, the private investigator the syndicate used for due diligence, sat across from him, sliding a thick manila folder across the desk with a look of professional caution. Yi Min's hand hovered over the paper, his calculating calm failing him as his fingers trembled, a physical manifestation of the unsettling questions multiplying in his mind. "I have what you asked for," Marcus said, his voice level. "Amani Rivers, 32. She's living in a modest 2-bedroom on Pine Street. She works part-time as a freelance marketing consultant, but the records show she's been doing this entirely on her own. No child support, no mysterious deposits, and no father listed on the birth certificates for Nia and Noah." The words hit Yi Min like physical blows. He opened the folder, and the raw data of survival spilled out in the form of surveillance photographs. The first image showed Amani pushing a double stroller through the gray Seattle drizzle, her upright and composed posture shielding the twins from the damp wind. She looked bone-deep tired, the kind of dramatic fatigue that comes from carrying the world on one's shoulders without asking for help. Yimin flipped to the next photo. Amani in a pediatrician's waiting room, juggling a diaper bag and a fussy infant with a practiced efficiency that broke his heart. She had attended every prenatal appointment alone, choosing devastatingly lonely independence over a man who had told her he needed freedom to focus on building his empire. He realized then that her silence wasn't a play for a larger settlement. It was an act of fierce protectiveness. She had shielded his children from a father who had openly admitted he had no interest in holiday traditions or engagement rings. The final photograph was an interior shot of her living room, a space filled with soft shadows and pale yellow walls that reflected a warmth his marble-clad penthouse would never know. Amani was on the floor for tummy time, her face split by a genuine, unguarded smile as Nia reached for her hand. The simplicity he had valued, the pleasure without responsibility, now looked like cowardice compared to the strength in that room. "She's been interviewing for full-time roles lately," Marcus added, "but it's a struggle to find childcare for 2 infants while working a demanding corporate job." Yimin closed the folder, his narrow, focused eyes stinging. He had built a global syndicate, yet he had missed the milestones celebrated with no one but her bobbies as witness. Everything he had prioritized over personal relationships suddenly felt like noise. He stood up, the decision crystallizing in his chest. He wouldn't hide behind intermediaries anymore. He needed to face the woman who had chosen silence over asking for help, and find out if there was any room left in her solid circle for a man who was finally brave enough to try. Yimin sat in his car across from 1247 Pine Street for 45 minutes, watching the Victorian-style apartment building through the evening drizzle. The structure was well-maintained but modest, featuring flower boxes and a small courtyard that felt exactly like something Amani would choose. Charming, practical, and carrying a touch of beauty that didn't cost much but meant everything. Apartment 3B had a single light glowing behind sheer curtains, and occasionally, a shadow moved past the window. Yimin assumed it was Amani, going about the routine of caring for his children, and the domesticity of it made his chest tighten with an unnamed ache. He reached for the door handle 3 times and stopped 3 times, wondering what right he had to disrupt the life she had built so deliberately. She had known him well enough to understand that fatherhood wasn't something he wanted, and she had acted accordingly to protect them. A movement caught his eye. The front door opened, and Amani emerged carrying a small bag of garbage. She wore jeans and an oversized sweater, her long braids secured in a messy bun. Even from across the street, Yimin could see the bone-deep tiredness in the way she moved, the fatigue of someone pushing through because there was no other choice. As she walked toward the dumpster behind the building, Yimin finally stepped out of his car. By the time she turned around, he was standing 15 feet away on the sidewalk. Amani froze, the color draining from her face as the Seattle evening stretched between them, filled with the soft patter of rain on leaves. "Yimin," she said finally, her voice neutral. "What are you doing here?" Yimin took a breath, his calculating calm entirely gone. "I saw you yesterday downtown," he admitted. Amani's hand went instinctively to her throat, a gesture he remembered from whenever she was processing something difficult. "Are they mine?" he asked, the question coming out harsher than intended. Amani didn't flinch. Instead, she looked at him with a protective fierceness that made her seem like an entirely different person from the woman he had lived with. "What do you want me to say, Yimin?" she asked. "I want the truth," he countered. "The truth is that I am raising 2 beautiful, healthy children," Amani said, her voice gaining strength. "They are happy and loved. Their lives are settled, and I have worked very hard to make sure they stay that way." Yimin stepped closer, and he saw her shoulders tense with protective alertness. "Don't I have a right to know if I'm a father?" he pressed. "You have the right to live the life you chose," Amani said quietly, her words hitting like physical blows. "The life you were very clear about wanting, no complications, no commitments, no children tying you down. Just 5 minutes, let me see them." Amani stopped, her hand on the handle. "Why? So you can decide if you want to be involved based on how you feel in the moment, so you can disrupt their security." I hired a private investigator, Yimin confessed suddenly, the words spilling out before he could stop them. Amani's entire body went still. You had me followed while I was caring for my children. I needed to understand, he pleaded, but Amani's voice cut through the rain like a blade. No, my children. The children I carried alone, delivered alone, and have been raising alone while you lived the life you told me you wanted. She pulled her arm free as he reached for her. I made the decision not to tell you because I knew you would show up when it was convenient for you, expecting me to justify the choices I made to protect them. The rain continued to fall as Amani studied Yimin's face, her green eyes searching for a certainty that usually defined him, but which was now replaced by a raw, desperate vulnerability. Above them, the synchronized crying of Nia and Noah grew louder, a sound that finally broke her resolve. 5 minutes, she said, her voice dropping to a weary whisper. You can see them for 5 minutes and then you leave. You think very carefully about whether you are ready for this permanently, because I won't let you disrupt their lives just because you're curious. Yimin nodded, unable to trust his voice, and followed her into the building. As they climbed the narrow stairs to the 3rd floor, Amani paused without looking back. Their names are Noah and Nia, she said quietly. Noah has your eyes. Nia has your stubborn streak. They are the best thing I have ever done with my life. The apartment was smaller than Yimin's walk-in closet, yet every inch had been thoughtfully arranged with pools of warm light and shelves of children's books. The crying stopped the moment Amani's keys hit the bowl by the door, replaced by excited gurgling. Wait here, she commanded, disappearing into a room where her voice immediately shifted into a soothing, melodic cadence. Yimin stood in the hallway, his chest tightening as he heard the wordless, enthusiastic responses of his children, a language he was supposed to understand but had never learned. You can come in now, Amani called. Yimin rounded the corner into a room that had been converted into a nursery, the floor covered in colorful playmats and high-contrast developmental images. Noah was larger, with dark hair that stuck up in all directions and eyes that were unmistakably Yimin's steel gray. Currently fixed on a tiny fist he was gnawing with serious concentration. Nia was more delicate, her auburn hair catching the light like Amani's, her green eyes tracking Yimin's every movement with an excitement that made her kick her legs. Noah James and Nia Grace, Amani said softly, settling cross-legged beside them. Nia Noah. This is Adrian. Yimin knelt slowly, terrified that a sudden move might shatter the peace. He had held nieces and nephews before, but this was a biological pull that felt like an electric shock. He tentatively reached out, his finger grazing Noah's stomach, only for the boy to release his fist and grab Yimin's finger with a surprisingly strong, trusting grip. Nia made a soft sound, and as Yimin turned to her, she offered him a real, radiant smile, the kind that lit up her entire face. She doesn't smile for strangers, Amani noted, a hint of surprise breaking through her guarded exterior. The implication hung in the room. Biology had programmed Nia to recognize his face, his voice. Yimin watched them with a mesmerized intensity, seeing his own expressions mirrored in their tiny features, Noah's serious concentration, Nia's stubborn chin. She's going to be brilliant, Amani corrected when Yimin joked about Nia being trouble. The challenge will be keeping up with her. For several minutes, they sat in a silence that felt unexpectedly manageable and natural, but Amani's voice soon pulled him back to reality. Your 5 minutes are up, she said quietly. He stood slowly, his heart heavy with the weight of the choice ahead. He had just met his children for the first time, and now he had to decide if he was brave enough to become the man they deserved. The heavy, iron-scented air of the Syndicate's underground command center felt like a tomb as Yimin stepped inside, his calculating calm, now a mask he wore with increasing difficulty. He had spent 15 years building this dragon persona, believing that power was the only currency that mattered, but the memory of Noah's tiny hand gripping his finger had rendered the entire room, the monitors, the maps, the weaponry meaningless. He walked toward the glass-walled office at the end of the hall where his second-in-command, Junho, was reviewing the quarterly trade returns. Junho was the only man who had stayed through every war, a man who believed that consistency builds empires, and that any sign of domestic softness was a lethal liability. "The Tokyo expansion is finalized," Junho said without looking up, his voice a low vibration of intimidating stillness. "We move on the shipping lanes by Monday. This is the legacy we talked about, Yimin, total control of the East." Yimin stood at the window, looking at the flickering neon lights of Seoul, but all he could see was the modest apartment on Pine Street and the raw data of survival etched into Amani's tired face. "The legacy is changing, Junho," Yimin rumbled, his voice dropping into a grave tone that made the other man finally look up. "I'm stepping back from day-to-day operations, effective immediately." Junho's expression didn't change, but the electricity in the room shifted, turning sharp and cold. "Stepping back, for what? To marry the Yoon girl and play CEO." "To be a father," Yimin corrected, the word feeling foreign yet profoundly right in his mouth. He turned to face his partner, his narrow, focused eyes reflecting a lethal resolve that had nothing to do with gang wars. "I have twins, a boy and a girl. They are living in a 2-bedroom apartment while I sit on a throne of simplicity and freedom that I don't want anymore." "You're choosing diapers over the syndicate?" Junho asked, a hint of genuine shock breaking through his calculating calm. "The board will view this as a broken rule. They'll see you as vulnerable. You've always said that domestic life is a trap that makes men weak." "I was wrong," Yimin admitted, his grip tightening on the edge of the mahogany desk. "I thought money could buy spontaneity but not responsibility. I thought I was too unavailable to be loved. But watching Amani raise them alone, watching her carry that pressurized weight while I lived like a ghost of simplicity, that's the real weakness." He began sliding a series of encrypted drives across the desk, the keys to the invisible shackles of his financial empire. He instructed Junho to begin the process of legalizing the syndicate's front companies, moving toward a legitimate empire that wouldn't leave his children with a blood-stained legacy. "I'm not abandoning the men," Yimin continued, his dominant authority as potent as ever. "But I'm prioritizing the orchestrated pandemonium of that apartment over these quarterly returns. If the board has an issue with me choosing my heirs over their expansion, tell them they can meet the dragon in person. But tell them I have a new business philosophy now, and it involves being home for bedtime." As he walked out of the command center, the knot in his chest didn't disappear, but it felt lighter. He was dismantling the only life he had ever known, trading his lethal reputation for a chance at a fresh start. He wasn't just a mafia boss anymore. He was a man trying to be brave enough to earn his way back into a mustard-yellow world. The transition from the sterile, high-tech command center to the lived-in warmth of Amani's apartment felt like crossing between two different dimensions. Yimin stood in her small kitchen, his tailored black suit making him look like an intruder in a world of silicone bibs and drying bottles. He had spent the morning finalizing the transfer of his day-to-day operations, shedding the invisible shackles of his old life, but facing Amani felt more daunting than any board meeting. She was currently swaying a fussy Noah in her arms while stirring a pot on the stove, her natural authority making the orchestrated pandemonium of the evening look like a practiced dance. "I can't let you do this alone anymore, Amani," Yimin began, his voice a low, grave vibration that competed with the hum of the refrigerator. He watched as she paused, her protective alertness causing her to stiffen. "I've looked at the reports. You're working freelance late into the night because you can't find childcare that's safe enough for them. That pressurized weight, it isn't yours to carry by yourself." Amani turned, her observant eyes searching his for a sign that this was just another uncomplicated whim. "And what is your solution, Yimin? A nanny you pay for from a distance? More due diligence from your investigators?" "No," he said, stepping into the small space between the counter and the table. "I bought a house in Wallingford. It's a craftsman with a fenced yard and enough bedrooms for everyone to have their own floor. He saw the immediate, stubborn pride flare in her expression, and he held up a hand. Wait, I'm not asking for a romantic reconciliation. I know I haven't earned that. I'm suggesting we move in as co-parenting roommates. Amani let out a short, incredulous breath. Roommates? You want the head of a syndicate and a single mother to share a kitchen and a mortgage. I want Nia and Noah to have consistency, Yimin corrected, his narrow, focused eyes reflecting a sincerity he rarely allowed himself to show. I want them to wake up and see both of us. If you need to work on a big presentation, I'm in the next room for the 2:00 a.m. feeding. If I have to handle a crisis at the firm, you aren't stranded without help. He watched as she looked down at Noah, whose dark eyes were already heavy with sleep. You're a man who needs total control, Yimin, she whispered, her quiet steadiness finally wavering. How are you going to handle a life where you aren't the boss? 8. I'm learning that my simplicity was actually just an empty vastness, Yimin admitted, his voice dropping to a raw, honest whisper. I'm choosing this chaos because it's the only thing that feels real. I'm not asking to be your husband today. I'm asking to be their father every day. Amani stayed silent for a long moment, the only sound the ticking of the clock and Noah's soft, rhythmic breathing. The knot in her chest seemed to loosen as she looked at the man who was willing to dismantle a lethal reputation just to be a co-parenting roommate. She didn't say yes, not yet, but she didn't say no. As she handed the sleeping boy to Yimin, she watched the dragon cradle his son with a calculated precision that was slowly turning into love. The proposal was on the table, and for the first time, Yimin felt like he was building a legacy that might actually be worth the price of the crown. The move to the Wallingford house was supposed to be a fresh start, a meticulously planned logistics operation that Yimin approached with the same tactical response he once used for syndicate takeovers. But as the moving truck idled at the curb of Pine Street, his phone vibrated with a pressurized weight that threatened to pull him back into the shadows. It was Junho. A $40 million expansion deal in Portland, the cornerstone of the syndicate's transition into a legitimate empire, was collapsing. A rival firm had swooped in, exploiting the broken rule of Yimin's recent absence to sow doubt among the investors. You need to be on a plane in an hour, Yimin. Junho's voice was a low, urgent vibration through the speaker. This isn't just about quarterly returns anymore. It's about the credibility of the new era. If you aren't at that table in Portland, the board will see you as too unavailable for the business. They'll dismantle the deal, and they'll dismantle you. Yimin stood in the middle of Amani's living room, surrounded by cardboard boxes and the orchestrated pandemonium of two fussy infants who sensed the change in the air. Amani was struggling to collapse a double stroller while Nia wailed from her car seat, a sound that made Yimin's heart hammer kick against his ribs. She looked at him, her observant eyes catching the way his grip tightened on the phone. She didn't ask what was wrong. She already knew the electricity of a crisis when she felt it. Go, Amani said, her voice a quiet steadiness that belied the exhaustion etched into her face. I can handle the movers. I've been handling everything else for a year. This is what you do, isn't it? You choose the empire. For a moment, the dragon was tempted. The $40 million deal represented the simplicity of a world he understood, one where problems were solved with calculated precision and dominant authority. But then he looked at Noah, who was reaching for him from the floor, his small hand grasping at the air just as he had gripped Yimin's finger in the nursery. Yimin realized that if he got on that plane, he was proving Amani right. He would be the part-time father, who showed up only when it was convenient for him. No, Yimin said into the phone, his narrow, focused eyes fixed on his son. I'm not coming to Portland. Reschedule the meeting for Monday in Seattle. Tell them if they want to invest in the future of this firm, they'll have to wait until I've finished moving my family into their home. Yimin, you're throwing away $40 million, Junho hissed. I'm choosing balance, Yi-min replied, hanging up before the doubt could settle. He walked over to Amani, taking the stroller from her hands with a warm and strong grip. I'm not going anywhere. The Empire can wait. Noah's nap time can't. The look Amani gave him wasn't one of gratitude, but of profound, startled recognition. For the first time, she saw a man who wasn't resistant to domestic life, but a man who was finally brave enough to prioritize the messy, loud reality of his children over the cold allure of a platinum watch and a boardroom win. As they loaded the final box into the SUV, the knot in his chest loosened. The deal in Portland was at risk, but for the first time in his life, Yi-min felt he was truly investing in his future. The following Monday, Yi-min walked into the Horizon Pacific boardroom, but he did not carry the usual aura of a man who lived only for the simplicity of a cold, empty penthouse. Instead, he arrived with a calculated precision that felt different, grounded, focused, and carrying the subtle, sharp scent of baby powder beneath his expensive cologne. Across the table, the investors and board members sat in a state of intimidating stillness, their faces reflecting the pressurized weight of the $40 million deal he had risked to stay in Seattle for moving day. You missed the Portland flight for a domestic emergency, Yi-min, one of the senior directors began, his voice a low vibration of quiet authority that usually signaled a vote of no confidence. The Mortys are already circling our shipping interests. They see a leader who is too unavailable to defend his territory because he's distracted by family dinners and holiday traditions he once claimed to despise. Yi-min didn't flinch. He sat at the head of the table, his narrow, focused eyes sweeping across the room with a dominant authority that had only intensified since meeting Nia and Noah. He leaned forward, his hands folded over a leather-bound folder that contained a new kind of due diligence, a strategic plan for a legitimate empire. I didn't miss that flight because I was distracted, Yi-min rumbled, his voice dropping into a grave, steady tone. I missed it because I was prioritizing the only legacy that actually matters. I spent years believing that consistency builds empires only in the boardroom. He slid a tablet across the table, showing a revised efficiency model. Since I took over the 2:00 a.m. feedings, I've had more time to analyze our logistical gaps than I ever did during sacred Friday night dates. I've learned to manage orchestrated pandemonium with more efficiency than any of you manage your departments. The board members exchanged looks of startled recognition. Yi-min wasn't defending a weakness. He was weaponizing a new strength. He explained that a man who has to negotiate with a stubborn toddler or protect his children from a devastatingly lonely future is a man who cannot be intimidated by a rival syndicate or a $40 million fluctuation. Fatherhood hasn't made me too unavailable, Yi-min concluded, his steel-gray eyes reflecting a lethal resolve that silenced the room. It has made me a leader who understands that a deal is only worth making if the world we're building is one our children can actually live in. If you want a CEO who only values quarterly returns, you're in the wrong room. But if you want a leader who can handle the chaos of a global merger with the same calculating calm he uses to soothe a crying daughter, then we have work to do. By the time the meeting adjourned, the $40 million deal wasn't just back on the table, it was being expanded. Yi-min walked out of the office, his knot in his chest finally replaced by a sense of extraordinary purpose. He checked his watch, but not to see if he was late for a business merger. He was checking to see if he'd make it back to Wallingford in time to see Amani's quiet steadiness break into a smile as he took over the evening shift. He was no longer just the dragon. He was a CEO parent, and for the first time, his empire finally felt complete. 2 years later, the silence of the Wallingford house was a forgotten relic of a previous life, replaced by a vibrant, orchestrated pandemonium that Yi-min now found more addictive than any syndicate victory. The Dragon of Soul stood in the middle of a sun-drenched kitchen, his platinum watch abandoned on the counter next to a half-eaten bowl of cereal and a collection of handmade paper cranes. He was no longer the man who believed simplicity felt like luxury. He was the man who found success in the messy, loud, and extraordinary reality of a home that never truly slept. "Nia, we do not put the remote in the dog's water bowl," Yimin said, his voice a low, melodic rumble that carried a natural authority born of 2 years of practice. 2-year-old Nia, possessing his stubborn chin and Amani's observant eyes, looked up at him with a mischievous grin before dropping the device and running toward the backyard. Behind her, Noah, mirroring Yimin's strong jawline and alert stance, was diligently trying to stack wooden blocks into a fortress that looked suspiciously like the Horizon Pacific headquarters. Amani entered the room, her quiet steadiness now infused with a radiant, unguarded joy that made Yimin's heart hammer kick, just as it had the night they met in the rain. She wore a sleeveless mustard yellow dress, her skin glowing in the daylight as she navigated the toy-strewn floor with practiced efficiency. She had recently accepted a senior vice presidency at a top marketing firm, a feat made possible because Yimin had stayed true to his promise of choosing balance over the empty vastness of his old empire. "The foundation gala starts in 3 hours, Adrian," she said, using the name that anchored him to this life. "Are we ready for the dragon to make an appearance?" Yimin stepped toward her, his warm and strong hands resting on her waist as he pulled her into the calm center of the domestic storm. "The dragon is currently occupied with a block-stacking crisis and a remote control recovery mission," he whispered, his narrow, focused eyes softening as he looked at her. "He'll be ready, but only if his partner is with him." Their lives were no longer uncomplicated, and their schedules were rarely simple, but the knot in Yimin's chest had been replaced by a sense of extraordinary purpose. He had traded a lethal reputation for a chance to be brave enough to love, and in the faces of Nia and Noah, he saw a legacy that no amount of money could ever buy. As the children's laughter filled the house, Yimin realized that he hadn't just found a forever with Amani. He had found the man he was always meant to be. The orchestrated pandemonium wasn't a trap to be escaped, it was the home he had finally earned.